You grew up thinking you knew everything about the Old West. The white hat heroes, the black hat villains, and somewhere in the middle, the savage Indians who attacked without reason before the good guys showed up to fix everything. Hollywood spent decades packaging that version, and you swallowed it whole. But here's the problem. The reality of the American Southwest in the 18th and 19th centuries was so different from what you were sold that it feels almost offensive to call both things by the same name of history. The Apache weren't extras in a Western. They were the most terrifying and most intelligent military force the North American continent ever produced, capable of making the United States Army look like a group of lost tourists in the desert, and they had very specific, very documented, and very valid reasons for every act of violence they committed. This video is going to show you what they decided not to put in the textbooks. The government that boiled a chief's head and sent it to New York City as a scientific souvenir. The massacre of more than 100 people sleeping under military protection that had a 19-minute trial and ended in total acquittal. The warrior who escaped 5,000 American soldiers because he simply ran faster than their horses could follow. When this video is over, you'll want to call someone and tell them everything. Because the real story, with all its brutality and all its absurdity, is infinitely better than any script Hollywood ever invented. The human machine that left American generals speechless. General George Crook, one of the most decorated officers in American military history, a man who had survived the Civil War and fought in dozens of campaigns, wrote about the Apache with a tone that few generals would use to describe defeated enemies, genuine admiration mixed with professional despair. His own scouts documented something that, if you read it in a science fiction book, you'd find exaggerated. Apache warriors covering 75 miles in a single day, on foot, in mountain terrain, under temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Not once, not exceptionally. Routinely. Like a walk to the grocery store. American soldiers, trained men mounted on rested horses, couldn't keep up. The Apache strategy was as simple as it was humiliating for their pursuers. Make 3 or 4 of those marches back to back, totaling 200 or 300 miles, in the absolute certainty that anyone who tried to follow would collapse before getting close. And while the most powerful army in the Western Hemisphere fell behind, gasping, the Apache kept moving, eating strips of dried meat and drinking water from an animal stomach. West Point Military Academy, with all due respect, didn't teach that. The name Mexicans screamed at the saints. His real name was Goyacla, which in Apache means the one who yawns. Yes, the most feared warrior on the North American continent in the 19th century had a nickname that roughly translates to Sleepy Guy. It gets better. During a battle against Mexican soldiers around 1851, this Apache became so famous for running toward the enemy while bullets flew around him without apparently touching him that the terrified Mexican soldiers began screaming, "Geronimo!" to St. Jerome begging for divine protection. The Americans who overheard figured it was the warrior's name, and so Sleepy Guy became Geronimo for the rest of history. What created this man? In 1851, Mexican soldiers attacked his people's camp while the men were in town trading. When Goyacla returned, he found his elderly mother, his wife Alope, and his 3 small children dead. That night, sitting in the dark beside the bodies, he heard a voice promising him that no bullet would ever kill him. For the next 35 years, the Mexicans tried, with great effort and little success, to prove the voice wrong. Spoiler, they couldn't. The escape that humiliated a quarter of the American army. In May of 1885, Geronimo escaped a reservation for the 3rd time. The American government, which had clearly learned nothing from the previous escapes, decided that this time it would solve the problem once and for all. The solution they came up with was sending more than 5,000 soldiers, the equivalent of approximately a quarter of the entire active-duty American army at the time, plus 500 Apache scouts and thousands more in civilian militias, to capture a single man and his 36 followers, counting women and children. To put the proportion in perspective, that's like using a 30-pound hammer to kill a cockroach. General George Crook thought he'd solved the problem in March of 1886, when Geronimo agreed to surrender. But days later, Geronimo heard rumors he'd be executed upon crossing the border and simply vanished into the darkness with 40 people. Crook was publicly humiliated by the War Department and resigned. His replacement, General Nelson Miles, spent 5 more months and 1,645 miles of desert pursuit to secure the final surrender. A quarter of the American army, 36 people, 18 months. Let's just let that sink in for a moment. The peace trap that started 25 years of war. In 1861, Chief Cochise was practically the only Apache leader maintaining peaceful relations with the Americans. He even went so far as to cut firewood for the American stagecoach station at Apache Pass. He worked side by side with settlers. He was, for all practical purposes, an ally. Then, Lieutenant George Bascom entered the picture, fresh out of West Point, full of certainties about how the world worked, and made one of the most catastrophically botched mistakes in American military history. A different band of Apache had kidnapped the stepson of a rancher named John Ward. Bascom blamed Cochise without any evidence. He invited the chief to a friendly meeting, and when Cochise arrived with his wife, 2 children, a brother, and 2 nephews, with the absolute confidence of someone who owes nothing to nobody, Bascom tried to arrest all of them. Cochise, taking 3 bullets in his body, escaped by cutting through the side of the tent with a knife. What followed was a hostage negotiation that ended with the Americans hanging Cochise's brother and nephews, and Cochise killing the American hostages. Result: 12 years of relentless war that destroyed southern Arizona. The kidnapped child, Felix Ward, resurfaced decades later as an Army scout, confirming that Cochise had absolutely nothing to do with the kidnapping. Thank you, Lieutenant. The head boiled and shipped to New York City as a scientific souvenir. Mongus coloratus was arguably the greatest Apache leader of the 19th century. Nearly 6 feet, 6 inches tall, imposing physique, rare diplomatic intelligence, he had unified different tribes and resisted Mexican and American forces for decades. In January of 1863, exhausted by war and carrying a bullet in his chest he'd had for months, he made the riskiest decision of his life. Go negotiate peace with the American Army at Fort McLean in New Mexico, under a white flag of truce. General Joseph Rodman West received the old man with all the hospitality a general with assassination plans can fake, and immediately gave a secret order to the guard. I want him dead tomorrow morning. Do you understand? I want him dead. That night, soldiers heated bayonets in a campfire and pressed them against the chief's feet and legs. When he loudly protested that he was no child to be treated that way, he was shot. Official report: escape attempt. The next day, fascinated by the size of the man, soldiers cut off his head, boiled it in a kettle to clean the skull, and shipped it to a phrenologist in New York City named Orson Fowler, who published analyses of the skull in his 1873 book. For the Apache, who believed the body had to enter the spirit world intact, that was literally the worst imaginable fate. The result was 25 additional years of war, great foreign policy, the massacre of those sleeping under military protection. In February of 1871, 5 old, ragged, and starving Apache women appeared at the gate of Camp Grant in Arizona, asking for protection. Lieutenant Royal Whitman, recently arrived from the east and not yet sufficiently trained in regional hatred, fed them and treated them kindly. Word spread. Within weeks, nearly 500 Apache from the Aravaipa and Pinal bands had settled near the fort, surrendered their weapons, cut hay for the Army's horses, and worked as labor on nearby farms. They were official prisoners of war under American protection. What could go wrong? In the early hours of April 30th, 1871, 150 vigilantes from Tucson, a mix of white Americans, Mexican Americans, and Tohono O'odham warriors arrived at the sleeping camp. In 30 minutes, using clubs, spears, and rifles, they killed between 118 and 144 people, mostly sleeping women and children. 28 children were kidnapped to be sold into slavery. President Grant called the event an unprecedented crime and demanded severe prosecution. In December, 104 participants were indicted. The trial lasted 19 minutes. Total acquittal. Today, there is no plaque at the site, no memorial, nothing, just a state highway running right over it. The revenge that burned a commander alive in a pit. When Geronimo planned revenge, he didn't improvise like ordinary people. In November of 1882, he and Chief Zhu set up an ambush with a level of planning that would make any military tactics manual envious. The target was Juan Mata Ortiz, commander of the Mexican garrison at Galeana in Chihuahua, responsible for the deaths of dozens of Apache warriors at the Battle of Tres Castillos 2 years earlier. The instruction passed to all warriors was precise and revealing of the Apache mindset. Don't kill the captain. Let every other man fall one by one. But the captain is mine. The Mexican soldiers realized the trap, retreated to the nearest high ground, and began stacking rocks for defense. The Apache calmly surrounded them and methodically eliminated each man from a distance, from covered positions, as if executing a protocol. Of the 23 soldiers, 2 survived, 1 infantryman deliberately allowed to leave to tell the story, and Juan Mata Ortiz, who was thrown alive into a pit and burned. More than 100 years later, tourists from countries like Germany visit the hill north of Galeana and still find century-old bullet casings rusting in the grass and the piles of rock the soldiers used as their last defense. History doesn't forget when you don't let it. The shaman that bullets couldn't hit. One thing most people don't know about Geronimo: he wasn't a chief. He was a war shaman. In Apache culture, that meant something far more powerful than any political title. A war shaman possessed dai, spiritual power that manifested in practical combat abilities, and Geronimo claimed that spirits had promised him no bullet would ever kill him. Now think about the psychological effect of that. You're on the battlefield. You shoot this man, he keeps coming. You shoot again, he keeps coming. And then you start praying to St. Jerome because clearly conventional ammunition isn't solving the problem. His followers genuinely believed he could see the future. On documented occasions, he warned his group about the approach of soldiers before any physical sign was detectable. We can debate forever whether it was exceptional intuition, carefully maintained information networks, or something that defies scientific explanation. What we can't debate is the track record. This man survived decades of war, multiple captures, exile in Florida and Alabama, and died of pneumonia at age 79 on a reservation in Oklahoma. The voice he heard in the dark that night in 1851 was technically correct. No bullet killed him. The training that turned children into living weapons. If you think your gym routine is tough, wait until you hear how an Apache boy made it to adolescence. Training began before puberty, every day before dawn, a bath in the river. In summer, fine. In winter, you broke through the ice with your bare hands and got in anyway. Then runs up hillsides on rocky terrain, with your mouth full of water that you were strictly forbidden from swallowing. Training forced nasal breathing for the long war journeys ahead. Apache children's games were, in practice, military training disguised as fun, tracking, ambush, camouflage, pain tolerance. When the young man felt ready for his first raid, a war shaman gave him equipment with specific spiritual meaning, and he participated in 4 sorties supervised by experienced warriors. Only after all 4 were successfully completed was he recognized as a warrior. No shortcuts, no participation trophies. Either you delivered results or you went back to training. The American generals who eventually faced them wrote repeatedly that they had never seen fighters so completely fused to their environment, so economical in every gesture, so absolutely impossible to surprise or exhaust. In 1886, 5,000 trained soldiers with every piece of equipment the American government could provide failed to capture 36 products of this training system. The numbers speak for themselves. The name their enemies gave that stuck forever. The Apache didn't call themselves Apache. In their own languages, they called themselves Ende, simply the people. The name Apache likely comes from the Zuni word Apachu, meaning enemy. Think about the grim poetry of that. This people was named by their enemies, with the word those enemies used to call them, and that name entered history, dictionaries, and the American Army's attack helicopters. There is no more ironic tribute than naming your deadliest weapon after the people you nearly exterminated. The groups Americans collectively called Apache included the Chiricahua, the Mescalero, the Jicarilla, the Lipan of Texas, and the Western Apache of Arizona, all with different dialects, distinct cultures, and their own histories. Some were farmers, others completely nomadic. Some had peaceful relations with neighboring tribes, others in permanent conflict with almost everyone around them. What united them was an adaptation to the American Southwest so complete it seemed supernatural to outsiders. A warrior capacity that Spanish, Mexicans, and Americans respected and feared, even while trying to destroy it, and a culture that none of the 3 invading groups adequately understood before spending decades trying to erase it. The prisoner who became a World's Fair celebrity. Geronimo's post-capture trajectory is the most American thing that exists in the worst possible sense of the expression. After surrendering in September of 1886, he was sent to Florida as a prisoner of war, then to Alabama, finally to Fort Sill in Oklahoma, where he arrived in 1894, still classified as an official prisoner of war of the United States. Then, capitalist America discovered that this man was famous, displayed at the Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha in 1898, at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901, the same year an anarchist assassinated President McKinley at the same fair, at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis in 1904, at each one selling autographs and photographs of himself. In 1905, the man that the American press had called the worst Indian of all time rode on horseback and paraded down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington at Theodore Roosevelt's presidential inauguration. Before the parade, he personally asked Roosevelt for permission to return to his ancestral lands in Arizona. Roosevelt said no. Geronimo died in 1909, still a prisoner of war. They bought the autograph, didn't give back the land. Very American. The war code that no military academy taught. To understand why the Apache were so impossible to fight with conventional methods, you need to understand that they weren't playing the same game as the American Army. While European and American military tradition valued direct confrontation, open field formations, and territorial conquest, the Apache had a completely different philosophy. Attack where the enemy is weak, take what you need, disappear before the enemy can react, and repeat until the enemy gives up from exhaustion. It wasn't cowardice, it was efficiency. Frontally attacking an enemy with overwhelming numerical advantage was considered stupidity, not bravery. Bravery was getting close enough to cause maximum damage and vanishing into the terrain before the enemy processed what had just happened. They painted their weapons black to eliminate light reflections. They wore boots with upturned toes to create ambiguous tracks. They knew every water source in hundreds of square miles of desert, meaning they could move through environments that would kill any regular soldier by dehydration. American generals eventually arrived at the obvious and humiliating conclusion: the only way to fight Apache was to hire other Apache to track them, not for lack of trying conventional methods, for lack of results. The warrior woman. The American government prefers "you don't know existed." Lozen, sister of Chief Victorio of the Warm Springs Apache, was recognized by her own people as a warrior in full standing. Not as a metaphor, not as symbolic recognition, as a warrior who fought, who strategized, and who possessed a specific gift that the Apache took very seriously. She claimed to detect enemies at a distance. The description was concrete. She would stand in the center of a circle, extend her arms, and feel a tingling in her palms that intensified in the direction where the enemy was. We can debate the nature of that gift until we run out of breath. What we can't debate are the practical results. She actively participated in battles for decades, accompanied Geronimo during his final escape, was captured with him in 1886, and was deported to Florida as a prisoner of war along with the rest of the Chiricahua, including the Apache scouts who had helped capture them. She died of tuberculosis at Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama in 1889. There is not a single federal monument in her honor. No big-budget studio film about her life. No street named after her in the cities she defended. The American Army named a helicopter Apache. That helicopter is called Apache. It is not called Lozen. Reflect on that. The Scalp bounty for Apache children that Mexico officially paid. To understand the unshakable hatred that Geronimo held for Mexicans in particular, shared by virtually all Apache of his generation, you need to know about a Mexican government policy that, said out loud in any room today, makes the air get a little heavy. In 1835, the state of Chihuahua, unable to contain Apache raids by conventional military means, began paying official bounties for Apache scalps. The amounts reached $25 for an Apache child's scalp. $25 for a scalp of a child. The predictable result of monetizing the murder of a specific group of people was a human hunting industry that frequently didn't bother verifying whether the scalp was really from an Apache or from any other indigenous person with long hair who had the misfortune of appearing in the wrong place at the wrong time. American bounty hunters regularly crossed the border to participate in this business. The attack that killed Geronimo's family in 1851 came directly from this context. It wasn't random violence. It was violence with an approved government budget. That's the kind of context that shaped the man who would make the American Army chase him for decades. The Confederate Army that also got beaten in the desert. There's a delicious detail missing from almost every Civil War history book. While the North and South were enthusiastically killing each other, both sides were also getting thrashed by the Apache in the Southwest. When Union forces were pulled from Arizona and New Mexico to fight in the Civil War in 1861, the Confederate Army entered the region with the confidence of someone who has no idea what they're getting into. Cochise's Chiricahua and Mangas Coloradas assessed the situation with the indifference of people who've seen this movie before. Any uniformed man coming from the east was the same problem, regardless of which side of the American flag he was on. In July of 1862, at the Battle of Apache Pass, Cochise and Mangas Coloradas assembled approximately 500 warriors to attack a column of California volunteers marching east. The battle was going well for the Apache until the Americans deployed mountain howitzers, a weapon the warriors had never encountered before. The noise and destruction of the first projectiles caused an immediate retreat. Mangas Coloradas left with a bullet in his chest and spent months recovering. In the end, the Confederacy lost, and the Union lost, and the Apache remained in the Southwest for another 24 years. The San Carlos Reservation, or hell with federal paperwork. To understand why Geronimo escaped reservations 4 times, it's essential to know the conditions at the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona, which officials of the American government itself described with impressive enthusiasm. No trees, no grass, hot wind blowing all day, clouds of dust and locusts. In 1874, the American government began concentrating different Apache groups on this paradise. Tribes with completely distinct histories, dialects, and cultures forced to share a strip of barren land with their traditional rivals. The promised rations arrived irregularly because corrupt officials diverted them. Traditional cultural and religious practices were forbidden. Movement was restricted. A people who had freely roamed millions of acres of mountain and desert for centuries was stuffed into a strip of land that seemed deliberately chosen to cause maximum suffering at minimum administrative cost. Geronimo's escapes weren't the whims of a difficult man. They were the rational response of someone who had seen with his own eyes what happened to those who stayed. 4 escapes. 4 times the American government thought it had solved the problem. 4 times Geronimo politely disagreed with his feat. The prisoners who had never fought anyone. Here's a detail that rarely appears in the standard history of the Apache Wars. When Geronimo surrendered in September of 1886, the American government didn't send just the warriors who had fought to Florida. It sent practically all the chiricahua it could find, including women, children, elderly, and, in a touch of irony, that would be funny if it weren't tragic, the Apache scouts who had actively helped the American army track and capture Geronimo. Men who had risked their lives working for the Americans were put on the same train as the warriors who had fought the Americans and shipped to Florida as prisoners of war. Many of these chiricahua died of tuberculosis and other diseases in humid climates completely foreign to the dry desert they knew. When they were finally freed as prisoners of war in 1913, 27 years later, only 269 chiricahua survived. Most had been born in captivity. If that sounds like collective punishment of an entire people for acts committed by a fraction, it's because that's exactly what it is. The agreement that lasted 2 years and the man who kept it. While Geronimo became famous for resistance, Cochise was the only Apache leader who achieved something no other managed: a reservation on his own terms, on his own land. In 1872, President Grant sent General Oliver Howard to negotiate with Cochise. Howard made a decision Cochise never expected. He arrived in Apache territory without soldiers. Just him, an interpreter, and the willingness to talk like adults. Cochise, who valued courage above almost everything, publicly acknowledged the gesture. The two spent days together in the Dragoon Mountains and reached an agreement. The Chiricahua Reservation would be established in southeastern Arizona, on his people's ancestral lands. In December of 1872, Cochise reportedly said that henceforth the white man and the Indian would drink the same water, eat the same bread, and live in peace. Cochise died of stomach cancer in June of 1874, honoring the agreement to the end. 2 years after his death, the American government dissolved the reservation and transferred his people to San Carlos. The word given to the most honorable man of the entire war lasted exactly 2 years, because honor goes as far as convenience allows. The 70-year-old warrior who made the army run. In June of 1881, an Apache named Nana crossed the border from Mexico into New Mexico. Nana was over 70 years old. He was lame from previous war wounds. He carried a bullet in his body that had never been removed. With fewer than 40 warriors, he spent 2 months conducting what American military records describe as one of the most agile and destructive campaigns they ever faced. More than 1,000 miles covered, at least 7 battles won, between 30 and 50 soldiers, and civilians killed, hundreds of horses and mules captured. And then he vanished back into Mexico without significant losses. The American general who tried to intercept him used more than 1,000 soldiers and couldn't get close enough for a decisive confrontation. Nana survived the entire campaign and died of old age in 1896. If you're mentally calculating the ratio of Apache warriors to American soldiers mobilized to stop them in this campaign, the answer is approximately 25 to 1. A 70-year-old Apache with a bullet in his body and a bad leg required the mobilization of 25 American soldiers for each one of his warriors, with no results. Just for context, the grave nobody knows where it is and never will. Cochise knew he was dying. The cancer consuming him in 1874 had reached the point of no return. Before dying, he gave a simple and final instruction to his warriors. No one should ever know where he would be buried. That night, they prepared him according to Apache ritual, painting his body with yellow, black, and vermilion, rode with him on horseback through Arizona's Dragoon Mountains, the place his people called favorite place, not stronghold as the Americans insisted on romantically calling it, and lowered the body into a rocky crevice along with his weapons, his horse, and his personal belongings. No non-Apache was present. No Apache has ever revealed the location. More than 150 years later, the grave of Cochise remains one of the most carefully guarded mysteries in the American Southwest. Archaeologists tried. Historians tried. Very likely, some enthusiasts with metal detectors tried too. Nobody got close. The man who spent 12 years destroying southern Arizona over an injustice he didn't commit, who negotiated the only Apache agreement that worked, who kept his word until death, sleeps somewhere in the mountains he loved, and the secret belongs exclusively to his people, as it should, the kidnapped child who unraveled everything. Decades later, Felix Ward was 12 years old when he was kidnapped by a band of Coyotero Apache in October of 1860. His disappearance was the trigger that led Lieutenant Bascom to incorrectly arrest Cochise, which led to the hanging of Cochise's relatives, which led to 12 years of war that devastated southern Arizona. All of that because of a 12-year-old boy. What happened to Felix Ward is one of the most unexpected stories of the Old West. He grew up among the Apache, learned the language, adopted the culture, and was completely assimilated. Decades later, as an adult, he resurfaced as an American Army Scout going by the name Mickey Free. Fluent in Apache, and extremely valuable to military operations against the same groups among which he had been raised. Then Mickey Free told what he knew about his own kidnapping. It was the Coyotero, exactly as Cochise had said in that tent while being held prisoner on a false accusation. The lieutenant who started the longest war in the American Southwest by failing to identify the correct suspect died at the Battle of Valverde in 1862 during the Civil War, before living to see the full consequences of his administrative confusion. Some poetic justice exists in the universe. It just always arrives late and undoes nothing. The wars that didn't end in 1886. American textbooks have the convenient habit of declaring the end of the Apache Wars with Geronimo's surrender in September of 1886. Clean, tidy, chapter closed. Reality, as usual, didn't read the same book. Small groups of Chiricahua warriors continued resisting and carrying out raids for decades. The last documented battle between the American cavalry and Apache warriors occurred in 1924, 38 years after the supposed conclusion of the wars. To put it in perspective, if the Apache Wars ended in 1924, the last veterans of them would have lived to see World War II, the bombing of Hiroshima, and the first electronic computer. It wasn't a distant past conflict that ended when Geronimo signed a paper. It was a resistance that continued as long as there were people alive willing to resist, with the resources they had, against an adversary with infinitely greater resources. The fact that this chapter of American history rarely appears in textbooks as the 40-Year War, it says a lot about who writes the textbooks and who they prefer you forget. The last enemy the Apache never expected to face. The Apache were specialists in dry desert, altitude, extreme heat, water scarcity, and rocky terrain. They had spent centuries developing a survival system perfectly calibrated for that specific environment. When the American government shipped the Chiricahua to Florida in 1886, it threw that entire system in the trash at once. Florida is humid, hot in a different way, flat, and full of respiratory diseases that the indigenous population of the Southwest simply hadn't developed resistance to because they'd never needed to. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and other respiratory diseases killed significant numbers of Chiricahua in the following years. Then they were sent to Alabama, which was better than Florida the same way a cold is better than pneumonia. Then Fort Sill in Oklahoma, where at least the climate was drier. The whole process took 7 years and killed a considerable fraction of the survivors. When they were finally freed as prisoners of war in 1913, 27 years after the surrender, 269 Chiricahua survived. The American Army had failed to destroy the Chiricahua with artillery, cavalry, scouts, and logistics for decades. The humidity of Florida managed what 5,000 soldiers couldn't. The battle cry that American paratroopers stole from a prisoner. In World War II, American paratroopers developed the tradition of shouting "Geronimo" when jumping out of planes. The most widely accepted version of the origin traces back to August of 1941, when a soldier from the 501st Parachute Infantry Battalion named Aubrey Eberhardt watched a film about Geronimo the night before his first jump and promised his friends he'd shout the name to prove he wasn't afraid. He shouted. The tradition spread through the American Army and then to paratroopers from other countries. Pause here for a second. The man who involuntarily lent his name to this military courage tradition died in 1909 as an official prisoner of war of the United States, 32 years before an American soldier first shouted his name jumping out of a plane. He had spent the last 23 years of his life displayed at World's Fairs and denied the right to go home. For the Apache surviving in impoverished reservations in the American Southwest, while paratroopers shouted the name of their most famous warrior jumping out of planes, that kind of involuntary tribute probably had a specific flavor that no translation can adequately capture. The people who name helicopters but have no federal museum. The American Army named the AH-64, its most famous and most widely exported attack helicopter, Apache. The Black Hawk was also named after a Native American chief, the Chinook II, the Comanche II. There's an entire unofficial policy of naming the most lethal American weapon systems after the peoples the country spent decades trying to exterminate. This is, depending on your angle, either a profoundly twisted tribute, or the military version of what happens when you put a marketing executive in charge of solving a public relations problem that should have been handled by a historian. The surviving Chiricahua today are split between the Fort Sill Apache tribe in Oklahoma and the Mescalero Apache tribe in New Mexico. The White Mountain Apache in Arizona manage a ski resort. Different Apache bands have their own tribal governments, constitutions, and functional political structures. But there is not, as of this video, a federal museum dedicated exclusively to the history of the Apache Wars. From the Apache people's perspective, there's the helicopter. There's the name on Army recruiting billboards, while the land, the culture, and the dignified recognition are still on the waiting list.